the first tremors were felt by those doomed to feel everything first, the astropaths. In the silent vaults of terror, their shrieks tore through incense-thick air, as if the warp itself were trying to claw its way into mortal lungs. Choirs collapsed as one, their sockets bleeding light, their minds overwhelmed by a presence too vast to articulate. Tech adepts rushed forward, chanting Binharic stabilizers, but nothing could calm the storm. It was not a message, not a warning, not even a scream. It was a return. Across the Imperium, the void rippled like a wounded beast. Navigators reported currents twisting into impossible geometries, their third eyes forced open by a pressure older than any charted star. On the bridge of the Imperial flagship Eternum, Captain Varos felt the deck shudder beneath him as the Geller fields pulsed erratically. Runes flickered, alarms howled, but no demonic signatures appeared. Something else pushed against reality, something not born of the warp's hatred, yet capable of rending its tides apart. Then the sky split. Above terror, above 1,000 watchful Auspex arrays, above the gilded spires of the Imperial Palace, a fracture carved itself open against the void. It was neither storm nor rift, neither warp breach nor known anomaly. It was as if existence itself remembered a wound long healed and began to tear anew. Golden radiance spilled from the rupture, illuminating the night side of the planet in a false dawn that made even the holiest shrines tremble. Custodians assembled in disciplined silence, their halberds aligned to reflect the unnatural light. Every one of them felt it, the echo of a presence once familiar, now distant, yet unmistakable. It resonated within their gene-coded memories, stirring something almost forgotten, the footsteps of beings who had once walked beside their emperor. The first silhouette emerged. A colossal figure descended through the sundered veil, armor scorched with impossible fire, cloak whipping in winds that did not exist. The golden flare behind him dimmed as if bowing in reverence. Vox channels flooded with static prayers. For a heartbeat, none dared speak, not even the custodians. Another form followed, then another, shadows of titanic warriors stepping through the wound in reality. Some were wreathed in stormlight, others cloaked in fire, others scarred by aeons of battle in the dark places beyond mortal knowing. Each arrival sent a shockwave through the warp, a signature of impossible familiarity echoing across time. On Macraga, Robut Gilliman halted mid-stride in the strategium as the tremor reached him. Holographic campaign projections flickered, losing cohesion. The Primarch closed his eyes, steadying himself as the psychic resonance struck with almost physical force. A sensation he had not felt since the Great Crusade pressed upon him. Brotherhood, strained by centuries of silence, heavy with unspoken history. Elsewhere, Space Marine chapters fell to their knees or reached for their weapons. Some cried out in awe. Others whispered litanies of fear. To the blood ravens aboard the Omnis Ardent, the signatures felt like the echo of a lost heritage. The space wolves on Fenris roared in uncertain triumph, while the dark angels locked their chapels and prayed for strength to face whatever truth walked from the rift. For the Imperium's common citizens, the sky became a tapestry of divine terror. Pilgrims wailed, clutching relics to their chests. Priesthoods declared a miracle. Others muttered of judgment. No one understood. No one could. For millennia, the Primarchs had been myth, saints, heroes, tragic ghosts. Their deeds had been carved into cathedral walls and chanted in liturgies. And now, impossibly, undeniably, they were returning. On the surface of terror, the void rupture widened once more. This time, The light that spilled forth was harsher, tinged not with gold, but with something rawer, deeper, a reminder that not all sons of the Emperor walked in loyalty. For a moment, the custodians stepped forward, halberds raised in unspoken warning, yet no traitor figure emerged, only the reverberation of distant howls, as if the warp itself growled at the possibility. The first returned Primarch touched the ground. Marble cracked beneath his boots. His helm dissipated in a swirl of radiant dust, revealing a face sculpted by war and destiny. His gaze swept across the golden plain before the palace, taking in a galaxy he no longer recognized. When he finally spoke, his voice echoed with centuries of loss and restrained fury. "This is not the Imperium we built." His words carried far beyond terror, carried by warp echoes, by psychic tremors, by the sheer weight of his existence. They reached Guilliman, who felt his grip tighten around the hilt of the Emperor's sword. They reached Leman Russ, hunting in distant starfields. They reached chapters who had long forgotten their true lineage. Above them all, the rift pulsed again, as if preparing to deliver more figures forged in the Emperor's design. But something stirred inside the breach. A distortion coiled through the light, corrupting its edges. The warp recoiled, then surged. Astropaths bled anew. Even the returning Primarchs turned, sensing the shift, their postures tightening. The tear in the sky flickered violently, as though some rival force clawed from the other side, seeking entry or vengeance. For a single, harrowing moment, the Imperium glimpsed a future carved in both salvation and doom. Then the rift roared, low, ancient, hungry. Whatever lay within had not come to honor their return. Whatever approached might unmake everything. And as the light flickered, threatening collapse, the Primarchs themselves understood that their arrival was not the beginning of hope. It was the beginning of reckoning. The rift convulsed once more, and something vast began to push through. The rift writhed like a living wound, its edges trembling as if some unseen predator gnawed at the fabric of reality. The Primarchs already emerged stood poised, their armored forms tense, their eyes fixed upon the convulsing light. What pushed from within was no simple echo of warp turbulence. It was a pressure, old and cold, as though time itself resisted the intrusion of beings who no longer belonged to the age that had birthed them. Then, with a violent shudder that sent shockwaves rippling across Terra's atmosphere, the next figure descended. His fall was not graceful like the first arrivals, but brutal, an impact that sent cracks racing across the marble plain. Dust billowed around him, rising in phantom spirals before dissipating in the unnatural winds. When he rose, his armor bore the scars of wars fought far beyond the memory of the Imperium, layered in soot and the ash of unknown starfields. His helm remained lowered, yet every custodian felt the intensity radiating beneath it, a force that strained the boundaries of the present age. More figures followed, each emergence shaping the rift's unstable glow. One descended wrapped in a mantle of stormlight, another surrounded by embers that refused to die even upon contact with the cold Terran air. Some arrived with the solemn weight of ancient burdens carved into their posture, while others radiated the battle-hardened defiance of warriors who had fought unending wars across temporal shadows. There were no cheers from the gathered forces, no triumph in their return, only awe and fear. When the last silhouette stepped through, tall, silent, his gaze sweeping the world as if measuring its decay, the rift contracted behind him. The unnatural light dimmed, folding into itself like a dying star. The rupture sealed with a thunderous echo that reverberated through the warp, leaving behind an aftertaste of dread. The sky darkened once more, but nothing felt familiar, not even the air. The Primarchs stood united for the first time in millennia, yet it was not the unity of crusading brothers. Their presence did not signify the rebirth of an ideal. It was an assembly forged by circumstance, each carrying a weight of exile that no mortal eye could decipher. They turned their gazes outward, taking in the towering walls of the imperial palace, the statues venerating their deeds, the cathedrals carved with their likenesses. Their expressions hardened. This Imperium was not theirs. The first among them, still standing where he had landed, removed his helm. The face beneath was marked by time's relentless carving, yet the unmistakable fire of purpose still burned within his eyes. He spoke not to the custodians, nor to the awe-struck soldiers lining the horizon, but to the brothers who had survived the long darkness. "We have returned to a realm of ghosts," he murmured, "a realm built upon our memory, yet starved of our truth." Another Primarch stepped forward, his armor still glowing faintly from the energies of the rift. His voice carried the low rumble of distant thunder. "The warp has changed. The Emperor's light barely holds back the storm. We were torn from the ages for a reason, though I sense no purpose we once served." The custodians exchanged glances, silent yet alert. Their armor reflected the fractured glow that lingered across the sky, their stance respectful but wary. Even they, the Emperor's perfect guardians, felt the tremor of unease. These were the Emperor's sons. Legends returned, yet legend seldom aligned with reality, and the Imperium had long survived by fearing its own myths. A Vox channel crackled to life. Robert Guilliman's voice emerged, strained with a mixture of hope and dread. "To the Primarchs who stand upon Terra, identify yourselves. The Imperium must know which of the Emperor's sons have returned." The custodians waited, anticipating the first response, but silence stretched across the plain. The Primarchs looked to one another, not in hesitation, but in quiet understanding. They had no need to declare themselves. Their names were written upon the foundations of the Imperium, their faces carved into its monuments. Still, after a long moment, one finally stepped forward and lifted his helm beneath the dim sky. His eyes reflected the distant stars, burdened with centuries of exile. "We are here, Guilliman," he said, "but we are not the brothers you remember." Across the galaxy, the message echoed. Aboard the Eternum, Captain Varos felt a chill run through him as he listened. On 1,000 worlds, Imperial commanders froze mid-command. Navigators whispered prayers. Librarians bowed their heads, overwhelmed by the psychic resonance of such titanic beings reclaiming their place in the material realm. On Fenris, the space wolves erupted into a howling chorus that shook the mountain peaks. On Macragge, Guilliman stood motionless, the flickering hololiths painting shadows across his face. He felt the gravity of their return settle like a weight upon his chest. Hope warred with foreboding. The Primarch's return might strengthen the Imperium, or shatter it. On the shrine world of Celestane, pilgrims fell to their knees, believing the Emperor's angels had descended. But even as their prayers echoed through cathedral chambers, strange omens stirred across the warp. Sigils flickered in the eye of terror. Demonic hosts grew restless, sensing the return of foes long considered lost. Back upon Terra, the Primarchs began to move. Their footsteps were heavy, leaving cracks in the marble as if the world struggled to bear their presence. They crossed the plain with deliberate purpose, approaching the towering gates of the imperial palace. The custodians parted, though not without silent caution. Something in the air felt wrong, subtle, shifting, like a whisper curling beneath the threshold of hearing. As the Primarchs advanced, one paused. His gaze rose to the heavens where the rift had sealed moments before. His expression darkened. "The breach was not ours alone," he said quietly, his voice sharpened by instinct honed in forgotten wars. "Something followed us, or tried." A cold wind cut across the plain, carrying with it the faintest echo of a distant howl, a cry of hunger or hatred or recognition. It vanished almost instantly, but its presence clung to the air like frost. The Primarchs exchanged grim looks. Their arrival had not gone unnoticed, and in the depths of the warp, across rifts unseen and uncharted, ancient eyes opened to witness the sons of the Emperor return to a galaxy on the brink of oblivion. Something was coming, something that had waited for them. And as the shadows gathered beyond mortal sight, the newly returned Primarchs faced the crushing truth of the age they had entered. They had not returned to save the Imperium. They had returned to see what remained of it. The echo of the distant howl lingered in the air long after it had faded, a reminder that the Imperium was no longer alone in witnessing the Primarchs' return. The custodians tightened their formation as the towering Gene-sires crossed the pale expanse toward the gates of the Imperial Palace. Their strides carried a solemn weight, each step a conversation with memories older than the stones beneath their boots. The silence around them was vast, layered with disbelief and a quiet dread that clung to the breath of every warrior present. Far across the Imperium, the psychic resonance of their arrival unfurled through the warp like a tide of ancient fire. It struck battlefields, chapel worlds, drifting void hulks, and fortress monasteries with equal force. Space Marine chapters, some kneeling before the Emperor's light, others hardened by centuries of grim doubt, felt the tremor of their gene fathers stirring. For many, it was a call they had long given up hoping to hear. For others, it was a warning. On Baal, Commander Dante felt the shock of it in his bones. The Medici attendants paused, watching in alarm, as the chapter master rose from a stasis chair he had not left for days. His withered features tightened beneath the weight of the psychic flare, and even the sanguinary priests sensed the ancient sorrow woven into the vision that swept through him. A silhouette of immense strength, its wings shadowed by flames, lingered behind his eyes, not sanguineous, yet unmistakably kin to him. Dante bowed his head, unsure if he witnessed a miracle or a reminder of all the Imperium had lost. In the distant Fang, the space wolves erupted in an untamed chorus, their howls rising into the storm-laden sky. Rune priests staggered as the psychic shock rippled through them, their minds filled with fleeting visions of a wolf king striding through fire and frost. The great wolf stood unmoving, gripping the pommel of his axe, his gaze fixed on the heavens as though expecting them to break open once more. On the rock, silence reigned. Dark angels gathered in shadowed halls, the glow of stained glass windows casting fractured light across their armor. The chaplains stood rigid, their breaths measured as they felt the return of a presence they had feared and hoped for in equal measure, a presence that would judge them all. Even the grey knights paused in their sacred duties upon Titan. Librarians sensed the arrival of beings whose psychic signature rivaled that of the most ancient demons. Their Primarchs were not psychers, yet their souls burned bright enough to cast shadows across the warp. The Grand Masters whispered among themselves, knowing the galaxy had shifted. Back on Terra, the Primarchs halted before the monumental gates. The custodians knelt, though their heads remained bowed in wary reverence. One stepped forward, tall, imposing, his armor engraved with symbols old enough to predate many of the Imperium's rites. "The Emperor is silent," the custodian uttered, his voice low. "His will does not speak. We cannot say why the warp has granted your return." A Primarch, his skin marked by a constellation of scars, his gaze like a storm held within human form, responded with a quiet intensity. "The warp does not grant anything. It takes, it twists, and it breaks. We forced our way through. We followed a thread of purpose. Whether it was laid for us or forged by us, we do not yet know." Another Primarch turned his gaze toward the distant horizon. The golden domes of the Imperial Palace pulsed faintly in the half-light, as though the complex itself felt the weight of their presence. "The Imperium is changed," he said softly. "It reeks of fear, reverence, stagnation. This is not the empire we built. This is a shrine to a corpse." The words struck the custodians like a blade, yet they said nothing. Their duty was unwavering, even before God's immortal form. A faint tremor shuddered across the ground. It was not seismic, it was psychic. The Primarchs turned as one, sensing it before any mortal could. A wave carried through the warp, dense with emotion. Awe, fear, confusion, recognition. The Space Marine chapters had begun to awaken fully to their return. In orbit above Terra, ships adjusted course instinctively. Vox channels lit with conflicting orders. Some commanders demanded confirmation. Others ordered readiness for possible heresy. Across the segmentum solar, messages were dispatched to far-off chapters, summoning their leaders to Terra. None knew whether they would be welcomed or condemned. In the warp, demons stirred. One of the Primarchs, tall, cloaked in crackling energy that shimmered faintly against the dull light, closed his eyes. His voice was heavy when it emerged. "Our sons feel us. Across worlds and wars, they look for their fathers." He paused, his tone darkening. "But the warp feels us as well. It hungers for the change we bring." Another nodded. "The rift we pass through will not remain dormant. The thing that clawed at its edges will find its way eventually. It has tasted our passage." Cold wind swept across the palace grounds, carrying the scent of ozone and old stone. The sky above seemed darker than before, as if the rift had stolen a piece of light from the world. The first Primarch to arrive, his armor cracked with warp burn, his stance unyielding, stepped forward. "Then our time is shorter than we imagined. Before we face what follows us, we must face what remains of humanity." The custodians rose in silent agreement and motioned toward the ascending steps that led deeper into the sanctum of the palace. The Primarchs began their ascent, each feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon them. Statues carved in their likeness lined the path, heroic, idealized, almost divine. Their real forms passed beneath them like ghosts returning to judge the myths built in their absence. Behind them, the wind whispered again. Not a howl this time, but a murmur hidden in the warp's unseen currents. A whisper shaped like a memory, or a threat, or a promise. The Primarchs did not look back. They did not need to. Something had crossed the threshold of awareness, something ancient, patient, and hungry. And as the Gene-sires stepped deeper into the shadows of the Imperial Palace, they knew the galaxy had felt their return. But so had the things that wished them dead. The great doors of the Imperial Palace closed behind the Primarchs, with a rumble that echoed through vaulted corridors and ancient stone. But even as the sound faded, the warp tremor that had shadowed their return continued to ripple across the galaxy. It carried an edge sharper than warning, something predatory stalking their arrival. And somewhere far from Terra, on a world ablaze with war, two of the Emperor's sons felt its call in a way the others did not. Old instincts, old rivalries, and old truths stirring like embers catching wind. The world of Hraxos burned beneath a sky choked with smoke. Once a thriving manufacturing planet, it had become another battlefield in a war that cared nothing for its history. Demonic incursions twisted the land, tearing metal from the ground as if the soil itself rebelled. Astra Militarum regiments fought in trenches littered with slag and bone. The air shimmered with the scent of ozone, hot ash and blood. And cutting through that ruin like a blade through fabric was a presence the soldiers did not understand. A hunter in dark forest armor, moving as if the shadows parted willingly before him. Lion L. Johnson strode through the desolation with silent purpose, each step precise, each breath measured. He had emerged from the rift not upon terror, but here, cast into the heart of conflict, as though guided by an unseen hand. The warp had spat him into fire, yet he moved with the same calm intensity he had carried into battle 10,000 years ago. His mind assessed the chaos with cold clarity. The demonic entities manifesting in waves, the fractured Imperial command, the planet's failing stability. But beneath the calculations lay something older, an unease he could not name. The whisper followed him, not in the air, not in sound, but in memory. A presence moving across the warp, a presence he knew. He reached the crest of a shattered hab block and looked across the valley below. Fires painted the ruin in flickering crimson, and through the haze he saw hulking shapes tearing into Imperial armor. Lesser demons shrieked around them, feeding on the broken spirits of the dying. The lion reached for his blade, already judging trajectories and weaknesses. Yet before he descended into the carnage, the air shifted. A howl tore across the valley, not demonic, not human, not anything born of Hraxos. The lion froze, the sound slicing through time itself. It was a howl he had heard only in memory, raw, primal, defiant. A howl that belonged to a brother he had clashed with in war and in pride. A brother whose presence could never be mistaken even after 10 millennia. Another tremor rolled through the warp. The demons reacted instantly, turning their heads toward the horizon, their shrieks filled with sudden anxiety. Something powerful approached, something they had not expected to face. The lion descended the rubble-strewn slope, emerging into the open as Imperial soldiers took cover behind whatever wreckage remained. They looked at him with terror and awe, recognizing neither his armor nor his face, yet sensing the immense authority radiating from him. He gave them a single nod, silent command, silent reassurance, and continued forward. The howl returned, closer now. Then the ground shook beneath a thunderous impact. From the smoke, from fire, from the very jaws of war, a massive figure burst forth, scattering demons with swings of a great axe that shone like a captured storm. Lightning crackled around him, illuminating the scars that ran across his armor like living history. His eyes burned with fierce amusement, as though even the horrors of the warp could not dim the fire that drove him. Layman Russ landed upon the battlefield like a meteor, his boots carving deep furrows in the scorched earth. He tore through a hulking demon, splitting it in two before its body evaporated in a howl of warp fire. The space wolves, who had survived the last assault, rallied instantly, their spirits igniting with renewed fury as their gene-father charged ahead, unstoppable. The lion stepped forward, and Russ turned, their gazes locking across the dying valley. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Two brothers, once comrades, once rivals, once foes, stood facing one another in a galaxy that no longer remembered the truth of their bond. The demons recoiled from them, sensing in their presence a force capable of altering battles, worlds, destinies. Russ grinned first, though the expression carried an edge sharpened by centuries of exile. "I should have known you'd crawl out of whatever corner the warp spat you into," he growled, voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Still brooding, brother." The lion's eyes narrowed slightly, not in annoyance but in recognition. "Still loud," he replied, "and still reckless." Their words carried no warmth, but neither did they carry hatred. Between them lay something deeper than rivalry, something forged in wars long past and never given closure. A demon surged toward Russ, its limbs twisting into jagged blades, but before it could strike, the lion moved. His blade flashed, severing its form in a single fluid stroke. The two Primarchs stood back to back for the span of a breath, their weapons poised as the tide of demons roared again, drawn by the combined presence of two beings the warp wished to devour. Russ inhaled deeply, his grin widening. "Feels almost like old times." "It is not," the lion answered, eyes fixed on the horizon. "This galaxy is not ours. We return to an Imperium broken, twisted into something unrecognizable." Russ's expression shifted, a fleeting shadow of seriousness crossing his features. "I felt it too. The warp trembled when we crossed. Something followed us." "Something still follows," the lion murmured. A sudden crack rippled across the sky, a distortion that bent light and sound. The demons howled, turning as if commanded by an unseen force. The Primarchs sensed it instantly, a pressure building, a presence clawing at reality, seeking entry. Russ tightened his grip on his axe. "Whatever comes, lion, we face it together." The lion's blade gleamed in the hellish glow, until the truth reveals itself. The air trembled, the warp shuddered, and beneath a sky of fire, two brothers, once divided, braced themselves as the next shadow of the age pressed against the veil, ready to tear through. Something vast was coming, something neither of them had faced before, something drawn not to terror, but to them. The tremor that rippled across the warp from Hraxos struck McGregor with the force of a psychic storm. Roboute Guilliman stood alone in the strategium, the glow of suspended hololiths casting pale reflections across his armor. As the resonance washed through him, it was not merely the sensation of demonic disturbance or the shudder of astropathic collapse. He knew those well. This was something deeper, older, and painfully familiar. It was the unmistakable clash of two presences he had not felt since the Great Crusade. Two brothers whose rivalry and strength could shape entire campaigns by their mere proximity. The lion and the wolf had met again. Guilliman closed his eyes, steadying the tide of emotion threatening to break through the discipline he had forged over centuries. The return of any Primarch should have been a miracle, a sign of hope for the Imperium's renewal. Yet what he sensed was not unity. It was tension, raw and untempered, as if their arrival had unsettled more than it had restored. He felt the warp shiver violently in the regions around them, a testament that their presence was drawing something unnatural, something hungry. From the corner of his vision, the hololith flared, projecting the image of the realm of Ultramar. Battle markings spread across its lines, alarms highlighting fresh incursions along the eastern reaches. Genestealer infestations, Tau expansion fleets, Orc migrations, threats unending, multiplying faster than his defenses could be restructured. Guilliman exhaled slowly. Even a single returned Primarch could alter the tide of a war. But the Imperium did not face one war. It faced thousands. The doors to the strategium opened with a hiss of pressurized seals, and Captain Agamemnon entered, helm tucked beneath his arm. His expression was firm, but Guilliman saw the tremor of awe in his posture. "My lord," Agamemnon said, bowing his head, "reports are confirming the psychic signatures match those recorded from the archives. Multiple Primarchs have returned. Their locations are scattered across the segmentum solar." Guilliman already knew, but hearing it aloud made the reality heavier. He turned toward the hololith, watching the icons shift to reflect new disturbances. "Which ones?" "We are still analyzing the resonance," Agamemnon replied. "But the strongest signatures match the Lion and Lehman Russ. Additional spikes have been detected near Terra. The custodians have sent no confirmation, but the magnitude of the readings is undeniable. The Lion, Russ, others." Guilliman's mind raced with the implications. The Lion's stern discipline could stabilize sectors collapsing under corruption and secrecy. Russ's ferocity could bring hope and terror in equal measure to war zones that had lost faith. Each of them held loyalty, yet each carried burdens and temperaments that could fracture the Imperium further if mishandled. And there were brothers whose return would seed only war. "Prepare the fleet," Guilliman said at last, though his voice carried none of the triumph that should have accompanied those words. "I must travel to Terra." Agamemnon hesitated. "My lord, with respect, Ultramar faces threats that only you have the authority to coordinate. If you leave—" Guilliman raised a hand, silencing him. The heaviness in his chest deepened. "If my brothers walk the galaxy once more, my place must be where their shadows fall. Ultramar is strong. Terra is fragile." He did not speak the deeper truth. The Imperium itself was fragile, held together by dogma, fear, and the fading glow of the Emperor's throne. If the Primarchs returned in force, the Imperium might rise renewed, or tear itself apart under the pressure of their conflicting visions. The hololith flickered again, projecting faint warp signatures that drifted like ghosts across the map. Guilliman recognized them all. Sanguinius's radiance, Dawn's immovable presence, Corax's shadowed silence, memories sharpened into blades. But not all signatures were blessings. Some were void dark shapes touched by crimson pulses and jagged warp scars, echoes of brothers twisted by the eye of terror. If they too stirred, then the galaxy faced not only reunification, but the rebirth of the heresy. Guilliman felt the weight settle fully upon his shoulders then. The burden of leadership, once shared among demigods, had rested solely on him since his awakening. And now, with their return, the burden had not lessened. It had multiplied. The decisions ahead demanded a balance that no mortal, not even a demigod, could navigate cleanly. He turned from the hololith, walking toward the viewport that framed the void. Stars drifted across the darkness, each one a flame flickering in the wind of endless war. Guilliman pressed his gauntleted hand against the glass. The Imperium was an empire decayed, a monument both to his father's brilliance and his father's absence. Its people suffered under doctrines he had never intended, doctrines he had fought quietly to soften since his resurrection. If the Primarchs returned to find what their legacy had become, how many would accept it? How many would reject it? How many would seek to reshape it in their image? A flicker of psychic energy coiled through the air, faint but clear. Guilliman straightened, feeling it settle against his mind like a whisper. Not words, not clarity, but intent. His brothers were not merely returning, they were being pulled, drawn by a force neither of the warp nor of the Emperor's will. Something was guiding them, or hunting them. Guilliman stepped away from the viewport, his decision solidifying with grim certainty. "Agamemnon," he said quietly, "summon the librarians. I need a coherent strand through the psychic storm, and prepare the Indomitus fleet for immediate translation." "As you command." Agamemnon turned to leave but paused once more. "My lord, do you truly believe the Primarch's return is a blessing?" Guilliman did not answer at once. He studied the swirling stars, the distant glow of battlefields carved into the void. The empire stretched beyond breaking. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "It is neither blessing nor curse," he said. "It is the turning of a blade we do not yet see, and when it strikes, it may cut deeper than the heresy itself." Agamemnon bowed and departed. Guilliman stood alone again. Across the warp, he felt the lion and Russ brace themselves against a gathering storm. He felt terror tremble beneath the steps of newly returned brothers. And beyond all that, faint, distant, watching, something stirred with cold anticipation. The Primarchs had returned to a broken age, and whatever followed them had not come to heal. The warp tremor that had brushed Guilliman's mind did not fade. It grew, stretching across the Imperium like a tightening cord. Its resonance was sharper than memory, colder than warning. It carried the shape of a presence long believed lost to the twisting labyrinth between realities. A presence forged from speed, fury, and freedom. As Guilliman prepared his fleet and the lion and Russ braced against the growing storm on Hraxos, another Primarch emerged far from the segmentum solar, where the boundaries of real space were thin as breath. The webway cracked. Deep beneath a shattered moon on the fringe of the ghoul stars, an ancient portal flared with blinding light. For centuries it had been dormant, choked by the remnants of Eldar wards and the accumulated dust of forgotten ages. Now, as the warp convulsed, the runes carved into its fractured arch ignited one by one. Winds without source tore across the barren plain, ripping stone from ground and sending spirals of dust swirling upward like offerings to some unseen god. A roar echoed from within the portal, not machine, not demon, but something alive, fierce and unbroken. A streak of white lightning tore through the gateway, shattering the last fragments of Eldar sigils that clung to its edges. The ground trembled, splitting beneath the impact. When the light faded, when the wind stilled, the figure standing in the crater inhaled the cold air of real space for the first time in 10 millennia. Jaghatai Khan opened his eyes. His armor was battered but intact, its white plates scarred by the energies of the labyrinth he had traversed for so long. The red markings of the V-Legion glowed dimly beneath layers of warp burn. His cloak fluttered in the dying winds, and his hand tightened around the hilt of his blade, a weapon forged for speed, honed for precision, and wielded by a warrior who had outrun horrors most could not imagine. Khan stepped out of the crater, his gaze sweeping across the ghostly landscape. The shattered moon was dead, its rock scorched by ancient battles. Nothing moved, no life, no sound. Only the lingering echo of the portal behind him, its flickering instability a reminder of the war that had raged within the webway. He breathed deeply. The air of the material universe was heavy, slower than the ethereal currents he had navigated for centuries. But it was real. It was home. And yet something was wrong. A tremor still pulsed in the distance, like a heartbeat too large to belong to any mortal being. Khan closed his eyes briefly, letting the sensation wash through him. It was familiar. Brothers had returned. The warp carried their signatures, rough and unhidden. He felt the lion. He felt Russ. He felt others, dim, distant, clustered around the shining beacon of terror. But woven between their signatures was something else, Something wrong. Something that slithered like a hunting serpent in the eddies between worlds. A force that pressed against the veil, searching for a weakness, seeking entry where the Primarchs had crossed. Khan drew in another breath. "You chase her still," he murmured into the silence. "Then let us see if your hunger has grown dull." A flicker of motion caught his eye. He turned sharply, hand on his blade, but the movement was only dust carried by the last dying gust. Even so, he knew he was not alone. The warp's pressure was too strong, its presence too deliberate. Something had followed him from the webway, tracing his passage like a trail left for predators, and if it hunted him, it would soon hunt the others. He began to walk, feet silent on the barren terrain. Each step grew faster than the last, his pace increasing effortlessly, until he was little more than a blur streaking across the broken surface of the moon. He needed a vessel. He needed to reach real space lanes. He needed to reach Terra. But before he could take to the void, the sky tore open with a sound like metal screaming. A wormhole of corrupted warp light unfurled above him, twisting into a spiraling maw. The air crackled with energy, sharp enough to sear flesh from bone. From within the breach, tendrils of shadow reached outward, groping for something with deliberate, ravenous intent. Khan's grip tightened around his blade. "So you have found me." The shadows recoiled, then pulsed, their movement aligning with a rhythm he recognized all too well, the cadence of predation. They struck downward, lashing the ground where he had stood a heartbeat earlier. Khan leapt aside, the earth exploding into shards behind him. The shadows moved faster, learning, adapting. He moved faster still. He sprinted across the plain, each stride a blur that left echoes in the air. The tendrils crashed behind him, fracturing stone, carving trenches into the moon's lifeless soil. The sky darkened with the swirling mass of the rift, its edges widening as if the force within strained to pull itself fully into reality. Khan knew what it wanted. It wanted him. It wanted all of them. It wanted what the Emperor had forged. He changed direction abruptly, charging toward the jagged remains of a collapsed ridge. The first tendril struck the rocks, pulverizing them into dust. A second aimed for his back, but he pivoted mid-stride, sliding beneath it as it thundered past. Sparks flew where the shadow ripped across the surface. Khan emerged from his slide in a fluid motion, landing with lethal grace. He did not hesitate. He leapt. His blade flashed, cutting through the nearest tendril. The shadow shrieked, not in sound, but in psychic recoil that reverberated across the plain. The rift above spasmed violently, and for the briefest moment, a shape inside it pressed against the edges. Too large, too vague, too monstrous to fully comprehend. Khan's jaw tightened. "I will not fall here." He sprinted again, racing toward an ancient observatory dome half buried in dust. He could feel the shadows retracting, gathering strength for a final strike. He reached the dome, thrust out his hand, and activated the long-dead structure with a burst of psychic will that cracked glass and overrode dormant circuits. The generators sputtered to life in a stuttering haze. The shadows lunged. Khan vanished. The observatory's teleportarium flared, consuming him in a burst of white light. The shadows struck too late, slamming into empty air with a roar of failure. The rift above convulsed and slowly began to collapse, snarling back into the warp like a wounded beast. Khan reappeared within the flickering confines of a derelict void station orbiting the shattered moon. Its corridors were silent, its decks frozen in time. Through the cracked viewport he saw the moon below, scarred by the battle just unleashed. He exhaled, steadying his breath. "The hunt begins then," he whispered. He turned toward the station's docks, where the silhouette of a battered but functional vessel waited like a forgotten steed. The Warhawk had returned, and something was coming for all of them. The dying echo of the collapsing rift above the shattered moon still pulsed faintly through the warp, when another tremor followed, a deeper, heavier resonance that rippled outward like molten stone struck by a hammer. It rolled across the void, through battlefronts, through shrines, through astropathic networks already strained by the return of the Emperor's sons. Gilliman felt it, the Lion and Russ felt it. Even Jagatai Khan, hurtling through the void aboard the derelict vessel he had seized, sensed its weight like a heartbeat beneath all others. This new presence was not a blade's edge or a storm's howl. It was a furnace, steady, unbreakable, burning with a patience older than most stars. Far from any stable trade route, in the depths of the Noctis Eterna, a crusade fleet fought for its life. The void around them writhed with black flame as a Black Legion war host tore through the final layers of their defense. The sacred Aegis, once a proud command carrier, burned in 7 places, its hull breached, its shield generator sputtering behind choking clouds of smoke. The shipmaster's voice cracked through the Vox, issuing orders with a desperation that no longer hid the truth from the crew. They were moments from annihilation. Demonic silhouettes clung to the void shields like carrion birds pecking at dying prey. Boarding pods hammered against the hull, each explosion echoing through the decks with the sound of grinding metal and ruptured dreams. Servitors malfunctioned, spraying static-laced prayers. Chaplains bellowed liturgies that could not be heard over the roar of impact. Then the warp flickered. A tremor swept across the fleet, not violent but inexorable. A warmth spread through the cold metal corridors, faint at first, then growing, as though the ship itself inhaled a breath of fire. The smoke along the command deck shifted, curling in unnatural patterns, bending toward a single point. The shipmaster froze, his eyes widening despite the soot caking his skin. What? The air thickened with heat. A spark ignited, small, bright, and drifted upward like an ember on an unseen draft. Another spark followed, then another. Within seconds, the air shimmered with floating motes of fire, coalescing into spirals, forming a vortex of glowing ash. The Vox operators fell silent. Even the alarms seemed to dim. The air ruptured in a burst of flame, but it did not scorch the deck. The fire curled inward, spiraling around a growing silhouette, massive, towering, its presence so heavy with purpose that every soul aboard the sacred Aegis felt it in their bones. The flame collapsed, and Vulcan stood upon the command deck. His obsidian armor glowed with the inner pulse of a forge master's furnace. His plates cracked and reforged countless times over centuries uncounted. His skin, dark as volcanic glass, shimmered with runes of fire that moved like living brands. His eyes, gentle despite their power, glowed faintly, as if illuminated by the core of a star. Across his back rested a hammer larger than most men, its surface radiating sparks that danced harmlessly in the air. The shipmaster fell to one knee, stunned into reverence. Vulcan took in the scene with a single sweep of his gaze. "Rise," he said, his voice resonant but calm. "There is no time for ceremony." At that moment, the ship shuddered violently as another salvo struck the starboard hull. A Black Legion boarding pod gouged into the deck below, its claws twisting metal as it prepared to vomit traitor marines into the corridors. Vulcan's expression hardened. He stepped forward, placing a hand upon the failing command console. It sparked beneath his touch, but the sparks turned golden, stabilizing the flickering systems for a heartbeat. "Your vessel still holds," he murmured, "but not for long." The shipmaster swallowed. "My lord, you are a son of the Emperor," Vulcan finished quietly, "like my brothers who have returned. Now show me where my strength is needed." The shipmaster staggered to his feet and activated the tactical projection. Red icons filled the hololith, swirling like a cloud of locusts around the remnants of the Crusade fleet. Volcano black sigils identified the Black Legion warships coordinating the assault. Massive, cruel silhouettes cutting across the void like jagged blades. "The traitors have crippled our engines," the shipmaster said. "If they breach the central chambers—" "They will," Vulcan replied, not with despair but certainty. "Unless we meet them." He turned toward the blast doors as they thundered. Claws tore through the metal from the other side. Sparks showered the deck. The lights overhead flickered as the boarding pod's clamps dug deeper, punching through the weakened support struts. Vulcan took a single step forward. The door burst inward in an explosion of smoke and shrieking steel. Traitor Marines stormed through, roaring praises to the dark gods as their weapons lit the deck with coils of warp fire. Bolts screamed through the air. Vulcan raised his hand. Fire erupted in a sweeping wave, not from the ship, nor from any weapon, but from the Primarch himself. Flames wrapped around him like a living cloak, splitting into tendrils that seized each bolt mid-flight. The projectiles melted into slag before they struck the command deck. The traitor Marines faltered, their war cries dying. Vulcan stepped through the flames. His hammer came down like the judgment of a dying star. The first traitor Marine exploded into shattered ceramite and charred bone. The second staggered back, only for a burst of fire to engulf him, melting his armor to molten streams that pooled at his feet. A third tried to raise a chain fist, but Vulcan's hammer struck his chestplate, caving it inward and sending him flying through the doorway from which he had come. The Primarch did not roar. He did not snarl. He moved with the calm precision of a master craftsman, each strike deliberate, each motion an extension of his will. In moments, the entire assault squad lay scattered across the deck in smoking ruin. Silence returned, brief, fragile. Then the vox crackled. "Lord Vulcan," a voice whispered, frayed with static. "A sergeant from one of the surviving strike teams. Enemy battleships are aligning for a focused barrage. If they fire—" "I know." Vulcan lifted his gaze toward the viewport, where the burning monoliths of Black Legion warships gathered. Their hulls radiated malevolence, as if carved from the void itself. The shipmaster stepped beside him, trembling. "My lord, they are targeting us. Then we will deny them their prey," Vulcan said. Sparks flickered across his armor as he pressed his hand against the viewport glass. Flames gathered around his arm, twisting into a vortex of molten light. He channeled his will, heat, pressure, fury tempered by purpose, and the fires rose higher, swirling like a living forge. The Black Legion vessels charged their weapons. Vulcan's eyes narrowed. He unleashed the fire. A pillar of incandescent flame erupted from the sacred aegis, lancing through the void with the speed and precision of a bolt fired from the Emperor's own hand. It struck the nearest traitor cruiser head-on. Its shields cracked, warped, then shattered in a burst of distorted light. The flame drilled through the hull, emerging through the far side as the cruiser erupted into a cloud of spinning debris. The other vessels recoiled, adjusting their formations. Vulcan lowered his arm slowly, the fires dimming. He exhaled once, and the flames dissipated. The shipmaster stared at him, overwhelmed. "My lord, our fleet is saved." Vulcan shook his head. "No, This battle is only the beginning. Something follows my brothers and me, something that hunts through the warp." As he spoke, a faint tremor rolled across the ship, a ripple of psychic energy, a whisper of something dark pressing against reality. Vulcan's jaw tightened. "The shadows have found us." He turned toward the corridor, hammer glowing brighter. "Prepare your forces. Whatever comes next, we face it together." And as the distant stars flickered, one by one, something stirred in the void beyond them, answering his unspoken challenge. The tremor that followed Vulcan's flare of power spread through the warp like a ripple struck from the heart of a furnace. It carried with it not flame, not fury, but a sense of something unyielding, stone-made will, resolve tempered beyond breaking. Guilliman felt the shift even as the Indomitus fleet prepared for translation. Khan sensed it aboard his stolen vessel, adjusting course without conscious thought. On Haraxos, the Lion and Russ paused mid-battle, exchanging a brief look before returning to the slaughter. This resonance belonged to a brother they had all believed lost beyond hope, a brother whose disappearance had carved an unspoken ache into the Imperium's legacy. It belonged to Rogel Dawn. Far from the reach of any patrol route, in the silent dark beyond the segmentum obscurus, a spectral silhouette drifted through the void. The Phalanx, mighty fortress monastery of the Seventh Legion, smouldered like a dying beacon. Its adamantium hull bore scars that no mortal weapon could have inflicted. Entire bastions were torn open, their interiors exposed to the void. Defensive arrays flickered weakly, their light too faint to pierce the shadows pressing against them. The great ship had endured the Unification Wars, the Great Crusade, the Heresy. Now it drifted like a lone citadel abandoned by the age that had forged it. Within its ruined corridors, warriors fought in silence. Imperial fists, those few who had survived the initial incursion, battled through breach after breach, their armor scorched, their breathing heavy. The foe that stalked them was no simple boarding party, no recognizable formation of traitor legionaries. These were things dragged from the warp, creatures that wore the shapes of men but moved like shadows, slipping between flickering lights and broken archways. Their claws carved runes of hunger into the steel walls as they advanced. Sergeant Tharsis staggered as another shockwave rocked the corridor, sending debris cascading from above. He raised his bolter and fired a controlled burst at the monstrosity lunging toward him. The rounds tore through its torso, but the creature dissolved into black vapor, reforming behind him. Tharsis spun, slamming his shoulder into the creature and driving his combat knife upward into what passed for its skull. The demon shrieked, its form contorting before it burst apart into oily smoke. "Regroup," Tharsis barked, even as exhaustion weighed on his voice. "Rally by the bulkhead." His squad obeyed, battered but resolute. They fell back toward the central battlements, where the Phalanx's heart lay. The eternal bastion. If it fell, the fortress monastery would collapse entirely, consumed by the warp distortion worming through its structure. But even as they advanced, the lights flickered overhead. A low groan shuddered through the deck, followed by a distant roar, deep, resonant, like stone grinding against stone. The demons halted, their heads tilted in eerie unison, as if listening to something no mortal ear could detect. Then they began to retreat, melting into the shadows as though fleeing a far greater threat. The Imperial fists looked at one another. "Why are they falling back?" whispered Brother Decimus. Tharsis didn't answer. His instincts sharpened, the hair on the back of his neck rising beneath his armor. The roar came again, reverberating through the phalanx like the heartbeat of a waking titan. The light steadied, then glowed brighter, too bright for a failing power grid. A wave of psychic force surged through the corridor, warm as sunlight breaking through clouds. The squad staggered, not from pain, but from the sheer presence flooding the ship. Even the wounds of the phalanx seemed to ease, groaning less, the hull's fractures pulsing faintly with renewed strength. Tharsis felt a pressure behind his eyes, a familiar weight, one he had felt only in the oldest ritual halls of his chapter. A figure stepped through the swirling smoke ahead. He emerged as though carved from the very hull of the ship. Towering, immense, golden light radiating from his armor like the first dawn piercing a storm. His pauldrons bore the sigil of the 7th Legion. His gauntlets were scarred from wars that predated even the heresy. His expression was unyielding stone softened only by the faintest warmth. Rogel Dawn had returned. The squad froze, their breath caught somewhere between disbelief and reverence. Tharsis dropped to one knee, unable to keep his voice steady. "Primarch, my lord, we believed you lost." Dawn's gaze swept across them, evaluating without judgment. "I was lost," he said, his voice gravel carved into melody. "But the warp does not keep what it cannot break." He stepped forward, passing through the faint glow of a failing lumen strip. His presence alone seemed to steady the corridor, forcing back the warp's corruption, as though the shadows feared to touch him. Tharsis rose slowly. "My lord, the phalanx is compromised. Something breached our defenses, a force we could not identify." "I know." Dawn's eyes narrowed. It tore its way inside, searching for me. The squad exchanged uneasy glances. Dawn continued. "It failed." A tremor shook the ship deeper than before. The lights flickered again, but this time the flicker was not weakness, it was anticipation. Dawn turned toward the direction of the Eternal Bastion. The heart of the phalanx trembles. Something roots itself there, trying to anchor the warp to this vessel. Tharsis felt a cold knot form in his chest. "Can we purge it, my lord?" "Yes," Dawn said, "but not alone." He strode down the corridor, his footsteps heavy, purposeful. The Marines followed, emboldened merely by being in his presence. As they descended deeper into the phalanx, the air grew tense. Metallic groans echoed through the walls. The deck hummed with unnatural vibration. The closer they drew to the heart of the ship, the colder the air grew, the lights dimming until only Dawn's radiance illuminated the way. Then they reached the threshold of the Eternal Bastion. Tharsis felt his breath catch. Warp frost clung to the walls like veins of frozen shadow. Sigils crawled across the floor, shifting shapes unnoticed by mortal eyes. And in the center of the chamber, suspended above the command nexus, writhed a mass of twisting darkness, like a cocoon built from the nightmares of dying stars. It pulsed, it breathed, it watched them. Dawn stepped forward. "This is the thing that followed us," he said quietly, as the shadows recoiled from his voice. "It chased my brothers through the warp. It hunted Jagatai through the webway. It sought to break Vulcan's fire. Now it has come for me." Tharsis managed to speak. "My lord, what is it?" Dawn's gaze hardened. "It is hunger made shape, a predator forged by the void between the warp storms. It has no name I would dignify by speaking." The cocoon pulsed again, and a whisper, not sound but sensation, brushed the edges of their minds. Dawn lifted his fist. The chamber trembled, and the cocoon split. Dark tendrils lashed outward like spears, striking toward Dawn and his squad. The Marines raised their shields, bracing for annihilation. But Dawn moved first, forging himself into the spear point of defiance. His voice thundered through the bastion. "You will not claim my fortress." He struck. His blow landed with the force of a dying star. The cocoon writhed, its darkness screaming across the warp. And as it began to tear, as the shadows sought to flood outward, Dawn stood unshaken, unmoved, unbroken. The last bastion had awakened, and the darkness had found its match. The cocoon's rupture sent a psychic shock hurling through the warp, a violent ripple that tore across star systems like the toll of a broken bell. The Lion and Russ felt it as they carved their way through the demonic tide on Hraxos. Both paused as the shadows around them shuddered and retreated, as if recoiling from an unseen blow. Jagatai Khan, racing across the void in his commandeered vessel, felt the same vibration tremble through the hull, sharp, discordant, like the warning cry of a predator struck, yet not slain. Vulcan steadied himself aboard the sacred Aegis as the aftershock coursed through him, his armor flickering with residual flame. And Guilliman, preparing to lead the Indomitus fleet into the warp, bowed his head for a single moment as the psychic echo washed over him. Rogel Dawn had struck a wound into something that should not have been able to bleed. Yet even wounded, the presence did not withdraw. It shifted, it spread, it surged, and the galaxy felt the tremor as though 18 great storms began to converge once more. On Terra, within the vast depth of the Imperial Palace, the Primarchs, who had arrived first, halted on the steps of the Hall of Eternity. Without warning, the air tightened. Candles guttered. The marble beneath their boots vibrated, responding to the psychic disturbance far beyond mortal comprehension. One Primarch, broad-shouldered, armor scratched by centuries, turned his head sharply toward the heavens. That was Dawn. Another nodded, eyes narrowing, and something struck back. The custodians sensed the quake as well, tightening their formation, though none dared move against the assembled demigods. The glow of lumen banners flickered in uneasy patterns across the gilded walls. A distant choir faltered mid-chant. Even the sigils carved into the pillars seemed to pulse with faint warning. The warp had grown restless, but the Primarchs did not remain still. They resumed their ascent, their steps heavier now, each carrying a growing understanding. Their return was no isolated miracle. It was part of a vast tension coiling through the galaxy, and the force stalking them through the warp, whatever it was, had begun to reveal its reach. By the time they reached the upper terrace, overlooking Terra's inner sanctum, the tremors had intensified enough that even the custodians could no longer hide their unease. One of them, his voice carefully measured, spoke from behind golden mask and polished halberd. "My lords, this disturbance, does it signify your brothers, or something pursuing them?" A Primarch paused at the threshold of the radiant chamber. His expression darkened. Both. He stepped inside. The Chamber of Oaths lay before them, a sanctum where statues of all 18 Primarchs towered beneath the vaulted dome. Their likenesses, carved with reverence and idealism, bathed the chamber in the faint light of stained glass windows that depicted the Great Crusade. Dust drifted through the air, stirred by the disruption of energies that touched even this hallowed place. The Primarchs, who stood beneath their own stone faces, felt the weight of centuries gathering like ash on their shoulders. The statues were wrong, too perfect, too triumphal, carved by hands that knew nothing of the failures that shaped them. A low hum vibrated the chamber. One statue cracked down the center, just slightly, splitting across the cheek of a stone visage that bore no smile. Another tremor followed, deeper this time, as if the warp itself exhaled against the walls of the palace. One of the Primarchs looked upward, eyes narrowing at the tremble in the dome. The warp is pulling us into alignment. Another turned toward the central mosaic, the map of the Imperium stretching across the floor. Shadows crawled along its edges, not demonic creatures, but faint distortions, like heat rising from stone. They moved with direction, flowing across the mosaic toward Terra's depiction at the center. "This is not the return of heroes," he murmured. "It is the gathering of storms." A custodian stepped forward, halberd angled downward in respect. "What does it mean?" The Primarch did not answer immediately. His gaze rested on the cracked statue before him. "It means the galaxy prepares to judge us, all of us." Across the Imperium, the storm lines tightened. On Haraxos, the demons that had once rushed the Lion and Russ retreated abruptly, as if pulled by invisible chains. The battle stalled in eerie silence. Russ watched the shadows vibrate, snorting. They flee like wolves sensing a rival pack. The Lion said nothing, but his eyes lifted to the sky, cold, calculating, understanding that their battlefield was no longer just a war-torn world. In the void, the vessel carrying Jagatai Khan shuddered as a pulse of warp lightning struck its outer hull. The Warhawk steadied himself against the console, tasting iron in the air, a sign of warp pressure tightening. "You chase all of us now," he muttered. "Not just one." Aboard the sacred Aegis, Vulcan felt the flames in his armor dim, then flare as something brushed against his consciousness. Not a voice, not a shape, but an intent, vast and ancient, brushing the edge of perception like a hunter testing the wind. In the phalanx, shadows writhed violently as dawn tore into the creature that had rooted itself in the bastion's heart. The demonic mass convulsed, as if receiving strength from a distant source, growing more solid, more deliberate, even as dawn's hammer shattered pieces of its forming body. The creature's presence twisted the air, filling the chamber with the scent of cold iron and old grief. And still, across every battlefield, every ship, every sanctum, the tremor repeated. One pulse, then another, then 18, in perfect rhythm. On Terra, the statues of the Primarchs trembled. Fine cracks etched themselves across stone faces, across stone armor, across stone weapons forged in perfect memory. Dust drifted from the vaulted ceiling in long, lazy spirals. The chamber lights flickered again. Then, from the mosaic beneath their feet, a pattern of warp light flared. Brief, sharp, unmistakable. 18 points of light, some bright, some dim, some flickering as though suffocated by shadow, but all aligned. A Primarch stepped back, breath catching as the realization settled upon him like a mantle of iron. "It is not just us who stir," he whispered. "All our brothers feel the pull." Another spoke the truth none wished to voice. Even those who walk twisted paths. The chamber grew heavy. The statues groaned. And far beyond Terra, across the eye of terror, ancient things awakened as the warp whispered names it had not dared speak in 10,000 years. One last tremor rolled across the Imperium, a tremor not of warning, but of gathering, of convergence, of destiny. The storm of 18 had begun to form. Loyal, lost, fallen, twisted, hunting, hunted. And the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. The alignment of 18 psychic echoes did not fade. It deepened, folding into the warp like a blade sinking into flesh. Across the galaxy, the reverberation rang again, circling back upon itself until the very currents of the immaterium twisted into new and terrible shapes. Terror trembled. The statues of the Primarchs groaned, and in the heart of the Eye of Terror, where nightmare and memory fused into one endless wound, something ancient began to stir. A storm brewed around the demon world of Scalathrax. The crimson skies churned with psychic lightning that lashed across jagged spires of obsidian. Rivers of molten brass hissed as thunder shook the air. At the center of the storm stood a figure whose presence could fracture sanity. His skin glowed like a furnace, veins burning with molten rage. His horns curved skyward. His armor pulsed with the heartbeat of a dying star. Angron lifted his head. His claws tightened around the haft of his chain axe as the psychic tremor pressed against him, carving through layers of bloodlust and torment, like a memory that refused to die. His breath came out in a snarl. "They return," he growled, voice thick with barely contained fury. "The others, they think themselves whole." The blood god's laughter echoed faintly across the storm. Angron roared in answer, the sound shattering a nearby spire into splinters of burning stone. Farther within the eye, upon a floating maze of impossible angles, Magnus the Red lifted a hand. Warp fire coiled around his fingers like serpents of pure thought. His single eye blazed brighter than it had in centuries as the psychic alignment washed over him. Beneath the shifting ground, thousands of rubric marines halted mid-step, their armored shells turning toward their Primarch as if awaiting a command. Magnus whispered, not to his sons, but to the warp itself. "So the Emperor calls his children home." A faint smile curved his lips, cold, unreadable. Or perhaps something else calls to them, something older. The crystal architecture around him pulsed. He closed his eye, letting the resonance deepen, seeking its origin. What he discovered tightened his hand involuntarily. Not merely a return, a convergence. Within the fortress world of the Black Legion, Abaddon paused mid-command as the storm tugged at his senses. The war masters around him fell silent as he turned his head, eyes narrowing. He recognized the signatures, all of them, some old, some forgotten. One burned brighter than the rest, a steady, unbreakable presence he had not felt since the Siege of Terror. Dawn. Abaddon's lip curled. So the lapdogs gather. He gripped the talon of Horus, its claws humming with ancient malice. Let them. Their unity will not save them. Yet even he felt the undercurrent of unease threading through the warp. This was not merely the return of old foes. This was the stirring of something that reached beyond the old wars, beyond the heresy. Elsewhere, hidden in the deepest layers of the eye, a figure cloaked in shadow stirred from a throne built of writhing flesh and polished bone. Conrad Kurz's eyes snapped open, reflecting the storm with a feral gleam. Madness and prophecy danced within them. "The dead walk," he whispered, pupils dilating as the warp sang. "My brothers walk, and with them comes the end." His laughter echoed across the cavernous throne hall, disturbing the shadows that clung to the ceiling like living things. And deep beneath a lake of living metal on a world long lost to mortal memory, the surface broke as Perturabo emerged, servitors scattering around him. His cold gaze fixed upward as the psychic tremor shook even the machines he commanded. "So they return," he murmured. Bitterness coiled beneath every syllable. Once more the Imperium crawls toward the illusion of unity. He felt another presence then, a heavy, hammering force. Not anger, not sorrow, duty, dawn. Perturabo smiled, though it held no warmth. Then the wars of stone and iron are not yet ended. While within a fortress of shifting bone and fire, Lorgar knelt before a towering demon effigy of the Chaos Pantheon. He trembled, not in fear, but in awe, as the warp sang with the names of his brothers. His voice was a brittle whisper. The sons of the Emperor gather. The prophecies converge. His fingers dug into the ground. But the gods prepared me first. Whether truth or delusion, his words sent new tremors spiraling through the warp. And there, deepest of all, hidden in the farthest shadow, something older than the heresy shifted. Not a Primarch, not a demon, not a force that bore any single allegiance. Something that had watched the Primarchs cross the veil. Something that had hunted them from the moment their return fractured the warp. Something that had not yet been named. It stirred now, awakened by the alignment of 18 souls strong enough to bend the warp around them. It turned its attention toward Terra, tasting the psychic light of the returning Gene-sires. It savored Dawn's defiance, Vulcan's fire, Khan's speed, the Lion's precision, Russ's fury, Guilliman's resolve, and it hungered. On Terra, the Primarchs, standing beneath their fractured statues, felt the temperature drop. Their breath fogged in the air. A pulse rippled through the mosaic at their feet. Warp light flickered like dying embers. One Primarch stepped forward, jaw tightening. The traitors stir. Another answered, and something else stirs with them. The air thickened, the lights dimmed, the statues groaned. Across the galaxy, loyal and traitor, living and dead, sane and broken. Every Primarch felt the same whisper brush against their minds. It spoke no language, it bore no shape, but its meaning was clear. I have found you. And the warp held its breath. The whisper that slithered through the warp did not fade. It coiled around every echo of Primarch lineage, tightening, sharpening, until the very currents of the Imperium felt as if they were being drawn toward an unseen center. The loyalist sons sensed it like a blade tracing the back of their necks. The traitors felt it like a rival god stirring. And the thing that whispered, that ancient, faceless hunger, tasted the tension with growing delight. The first world to fall to the storm was Virelion. Once a shrine world renowned for its luminous cathedrals and vaults of relics, it now sat beneath a sky bruised purple by warp pressure. Pilgrims knelt in open plazas, praying desperately as thunder roared without clouds. Electric storms crawled across the sky in erratic patterns, illuminating the dome of the high basilica with sickly light. Priests clutched relics that glowed faintly, as if reacting to something drawing near. And then the tears opened. Warp fissures split the air like claws rending parchment. Demons poured through, not in chaotic swarms, but in coordinated ranks, unnatural precision guiding every step. Their forms were strange, armored silhouettes whose shapes flickered between mortal and monstrous, as if sculpted from memories rather than flesh. They marched in disciplined formations, their footfalls echoing like drums. Pilgrims fled in terror, their prayers torn away by the shrieks of warp fire. At the heart of the planet's defense grid, Chapter Master Vordain of the Adamant Spears braced his bolter against a fortification wall. His armor was scorched, his helm cracked, yet his stance was unyielding. "Hold the line," he roared as demonic warriors advanced across the plaza. "For Terra, for the Emperor." The words died as the air behind him ruptured. A massive axe head emerged from the tear, glowing like molten brass. The demon who stepped through towered above its kin, its form shifting between armored giant and horned monstrosity. Its voice rumbled like stone collapsing beneath the sea. Ungron had arrived at the head of a demon legion. His roar split the sky, and every mortal courage withered beneath it. But even as he charged into the defenders, another tremor rolled across the warp, strong, clear, undeniable. A call, a challenge, a clash of Primarch resonance. Angron halted mid-stride, nostrils flaring as he tasted the psychic air, his lips peeled back in a grin. "They gather," he growled. "Then let them see the first of my gifts." His axe rose. The plaza became a slaughter. On Terra, the Primarchs felt the shockwave from Verelion even before the astropaths could form words. One of them stepped forward, fists clenching. "A Primarch leads that assault." Another answered, "Not only a Primarch, a demon Primarch." A cold silence settled among them. The loyalist sons had returned only to find their fallen brothers stirring in answer. But even this was not the heart of the storm. Across the void, Guilliman's fleet tore through warp space, its Geller field strained by the psychic tension gripping the Imperium. The librarians aboard the flagship struggled against visions that flashed like blades across their minds. Images of burning, shrines, collapsing fortresses, and a darkness threading between battles like a sentient shadow. Guilliman stood upon the command dais, fingers pressed against the railing. "Reports?" he demanded. A Vox officer swallowed hard. "My lord, a wave of coordinated assaults is spreading across 4 subsectors. They strike holy worlds, supply chains, communication nexuses. Precision strikes, not random demonic incursions. This is strategy. Strategy, not Angron, not Kurz, not rampaging madness. A mind was orchestrating this. Someone, something, was using the traitor Primarchs as the first blow in a larger design." Before Guilliman could answer, the warp flickered. A new tremor struck. The hololithic map distorted, and a flare of energy pulsed across its surface. The Lion's signature, Russ's, Vulcan's, Dawn's, Khan's, all resonating at once. Guilliman lifted his head sharply. "They converge," he murmured. At that same moment, in the depths of the phalanx, Dawn battled the writhing heart of the shadow creature. Flames from Vulcan's distant battle, stormlight from Khan's escape, the psychic tremors from Terra, all seemed to pull the entity apart. But as Dawn's hammer cracked its shell, he felt something horrifying. The creature was not dying, it was splitting, multiplying, as if its purpose was not to destroy, but to spread. Dawn's eyes widened with the realization. "This is no demon," he growled. "This is a herald." The cocoon exploded outward, fragments of living shadow scattering into vents, ducts, conduits, spreading through the phalanx like spores seeking new hosts. Dawn swung again, shattering a mass of darkness before it could escape. But more fled into the bowels of the fortress monastery. "My lord," Tharsis shouted, "should we seal the ship?" "No," Dawn answered. "We hunt it." But even as he spoke, he heard a second pulse through the warp, stronger, sharper. On Hraxos, Russ lifted his head, eyes narrowing. The lion did the same. "That was Perturabo," the lion said softly. Russ spat. "Then the wars of our fathers rise again." Jagatai Khan felt the tremor as his vessel ripped out of warp into the systems near Verelion. He stared at the burning world, his gauntleted fingers tightening around the controls. "Too slow," he muttered, "but not too late." He angled the ship toward the surface. The Ashen Crusade had begun. Not a campaign of glory, not a defense of faith, but a war ignited by the awakening of all Primarchs, loyal and traitor, pulled into a convergence whose architect remained unseen, unnamed, and unbound. And in the warp, as battles erupted across a dozen fronts, the whisper returned, clearer than before. "I am not yet whole, but soon, very soon." And the galaxy shuddered beneath the weight of its promise. The whisper that had slithered across the warp now pressed deeper, threading itself into every psychic current like a blade sliding between ribs, It grew, clearer with every passing moment, sharpening into a presence that felt neither demonic nor wholly mortal. Across the battlefields of the Imperium, Primarchs and traitor kings alike sensed its tightening hold. But on Terra, at the heart of humanity's fading light, its weight fell heaviest. Within the Imperial Palace, the Chamber of Oaths dimmed to a muted gold, as the loyalist Primarchs stepped deeper toward the inner sanctum. The air grew warmer, then colder, shifting with unstable pulses that made even the custodians tense. Statues trembled, dust fell in thin silver streams from the vaulted arches, and the lingering echo of the alignment hummed beneath their boots, like a distant engine struggling to restart. One Primarch paused beside the cracked effigy of a fallen brother. He lifted his gaze to the towering stone face, solemn and shadowed. "He feels it," he murmured, voice rising like a quiet truth. "Our father senses this gathering storm." Another stepped forward, helm under his arm. "The Emperor has not stirred in 10,000 years, he said. "If he moves now, it is because something reaches for his throne." The custodians did not speak. Their discipline held, but they felt it too, a tremor at the edge of their minds, like the faint echo of a colossal heartbeat buried beneath the throne. The Primarchs advanced deeper into the palace, entering corridors where mortals had not breathed in centuries. The walls here were carved with history, the Great Crusade in radiant gold, the battles of the heresy etched in somber brass. Torches flickered with pale light, illuminating cracks that spidered through ancient marble. The warp tremor followed them, distorting the air, warping it with faint ripples as if reality itself recoiled from some approaching presence. A custodian stepped forward, halberd angled low in respect. "My lords, beyond this point lies the Sanctum Imperialis. Only the chosen may walk its halls." The Primarch in the lead nodded once. No words were needed. The doors opened. A wave of cold washed over them, pure, suffocating, absolute. Not the cold of winter or void, but the cold left behind when the warp recoils from something greater than itself. Their breath steamed as they entered, their footsteps echoing off the vast chamber walls. Blue flame burned in towering braziers, casting the hall in ethereal shadow. And far ahead, bathed in radiant, agonizing light, sat the golden throne. Its monumental frame glowed like the surface of a dying star. Golden plates, cracked and reforged countless times, hummed with the strain of holding the Astronomicon against the rising tide of the warp. Cables thicker than a man wound into its base like roots, driven deep into the bedrock of terror. Every seam seeped faint psychic pressure, a tidal pull that resonated in the bones of every Primarch who stepped into its presence. And there, seated atop its vast seat, silent, unmoving, bound by fate and machinery, was the Emperor of Mankind. His form was skeletal, yet radiant. His armor was gilded yet fractured, plates fused with living fire. His face, ancient and still, was veiled by a halo of burning gold so bright the Primarchs instinctively lowered their eyes. But they felt him. His presence pressed against their minds like a mountain leaning forward. It was not the warm radiance they remembered, nor the terrible power of the heresy. It was something older, buried, awakening. The first Primarch approached, falling to one knee. The others followed, their voices silent but their loyalty palpable. For a long moment there was nothing, no movement, no breath, no sound except the faint hum of the throne. Then the warp trembled. A crackle of energy arced from the Emperor's helm to the conduits behind him. The Primarchs flinched as the light flared, brief but unmistakable. The air hummed with psychic pressure. A voice did not speak, yet they all felt its intent, its warning, its strain. It was as though their father looked upon them again, not through eyes, but through the sheer weight of his will. One Primarch rose, jaw tightening. He knows. He feels them gathering. Another exhaled slowly, and he feels what hunts us. The light around the Emperor flickered violently as another warp tremor rolled across the chamber, this one sharper, carrying with it a scent of ash and cold iron. It was as if the warp itself pressed its face against the palace walls, whispering through the cracks. One Primarch stepped closer to the throne, fists clenching. "Father, if you stir now, then speak. Even a whisper, even a single command." The air trembled. A faint ripple of golden energy spread across the floor, but no words came. The Emperor's radiance pulsed once, dimmed, then steadied, exhausted, resisting, enduring. The strain of holding the Astronomicon flickered across the chamber like heat rising from a dying forge. And yet something had changed. They felt it. A shift in his silence, a weight in his stillness, a message without sound. Prepare. Before any of them could speak, the warp shook again. This time the shockwave came not from Dawn's battle, nor from Angren's assault, but from far across the Imperium, beyond Ultramar, beyond the Ghoul stars, in a region of space long abandoned. A Primarch staggered back, gripping the railing of the throne's platform. "What was that?" Another answered, eyes widening. "A Primarch, but not one of ours." The custodians exchanged fearful glances. Guilliman's fleet felt it. Khan felt it. Vulcan felt it. Russ and the Lion felt it. Even the traitor Primarchs paused in mid-command, their expressions flickering with an emotion almost foreign to them. Recognition. A Primarch none had sensed in 10,000 years had awakened. A Primarch whose fate had been sealed in silence. A Primarch whose name alone once altered the course of wars. A Primarch thought lost to the warp's deepest abyss. The tremor whispered, his echo across the galaxy, and the Emperor's golden light flared so violently that the Primarchs shielded their eyes, unable to stand within the full force of it. When the light dimmed, one truth settled upon them with suffocating certainty. He was returning, and the thing hunting all of them had felt him first. The convergence that had begun as faint tremors across the warp now erupted into a storm of unimaginable magnitude. Worlds across the segmentum solar trembled under the psychic resonance of returned Primarchs, both loyal and traitor. The sky above Terra, already bruised by centuries of decay and strain, split again with the fury of warp lightning, signaling the opening of a dozen minor rifts, each throbbing with a malign intelligence. The Loyalists understood immediately. This was not random chaos. Every surge of power, every flicker of warp light, pointed to a galaxy-wide civil war waiting to ignite. Verelion had fallen. Its surface was littered with shattered fortresses, rivers of molten steel, and demonic husks. Yet even in ruin, the survivors recognized a pattern. The shadow of strategy behind the madness. Angren and the forces of chaos commanded with brutal efficiency, anticipating the loyalist responses before they could be executed. Yet at the edge of orbit, Guilliman's Indomitus fleet tore through the void, its ships bristling with weapons, psychic wards blazing, each strike coordinated to suppress the demonic surge while holding enough strength to defend Terra itself. On Hraxos, the Lion and Russ fought back-to-back amidst the burning cities, their martial prowess slicing through legions of corrupted beings. The Lion's precision created corridors of order through chaos, while Russ's feral fury left a trail of broken enemy ranks. Demons recoiled, sensing a power older than their own, a clarity that cut through the madness and the deceit. Soldiers who had once thought their chapter lost in history felt courage rekindle, emboldened by the presence of their gene-sires. Vulcan, aboard the sacred Aegis, had become a living bulwark, his fire and force holding back waves of assault as the Black Legion's warships and demonic fleets converged. He moved through the ship like a furnace incarnate, striking with the precision of a craftsman and the power of a god. With each swing of his hammer, he shattered boarding parties, deflected incoming fire, and stabilized sections of the fleet threatened with collapse. The Primarch's return was not merely symbolic. It was practical, immediate, and terrifying in its effectiveness. In the phalanx, Dawn's hammer shattered the final remnants of the shadow creature's cocoon. Yet even as its pieces dissolved into nothingness, the Primarch felt it in the marrow of his bones. The entity had splintered, dispersed across the Imperium, leaving seeds of corruption in every fortress, every system, every battlefront. The Loyalists were fighting the symptoms, not the architect. Above Macragge, Guilliman's flagship shuddered as a psychic pulse swept through the fleet, originating from terror. The Emperor's presence flared through the Astronomicon with a force that made the navigator's eyes bleed, and a single, crushing truth hammered itself into Guilliman's mind. The Emperor's awareness had woken the galaxy fully to the Primarch's return, and the warp itself had responded. Forces both loyal and corrupt shifted in anticipation. Strategy had become instinct, and instinct was now a battle against fate itself. Elsewhere, the returning traitor Primarchs, scattered across the galaxy, sensed one another as well. Magnus felt it in the eye of terror, his psychic might flaring in response to the synchrony of all consciousnesses. Mortarion and Lorgar coordinated subtle incursions without need for speech. Kurz, ever the harbinger of terror, orchestrated acts of subtle chaos that struck fear into planetary governors before any strike fleets could arrive. Even Abaddon, watching the converging conflict, realized that the return of the Loyalists would provoke an escalation beyond anything the Black Legion had imagined. The battlefield was no longer a series of individual wars. It was a single, massive convergence of wills, strategy, and sheer psychic pressure. Fleet battles collided with planetary assaults. Demonic armies met space marine legions, and the very warp quaked as though the galaxy itself were a single, living weapon, braced for the clash of titanic minds and forces. Terror itself became the focal point. The Loyalist Primarchs gathered beneath the High Basilica, their presence commanding the defense of the planet, even as traitor forces orchestrated attacks across the globe. The custodians fell into formation around them, halberds angled in disciplined precision, their loyalty to the Emperor unshakable even in the presence of such immense power. The warp trembled overhead, yet the Primarchs did not falter. In the void, the Indomitus fleet clashed with Black Legion capital ships. Vulcan's fire tore through their hulls. Guilliman's stratagems outmaneuvered their formations, and Khan's sudden strikes in warp-displaced craft shattered boarding contingents before they could breach Loyalist decks. Hraxos, Verelion, and countless other worlds bore the scars of this titanic struggle, each battle feeding into the next, weaving an Imperium-wide tapestry of fury, strategy, and desperate resistance. And yet, through it all, the whisper persisted. Across the Immaterium, it threaded through the mind of every returning Primarch, loyal and traitor alike. It had no form, no shape, but its message was undeniable. The war being waged was only the beginning. The architect of the chaos watched, waited, and adapted, Every movement of the loyalists, every reaction of the traitors, every flare of the Emperor's light was anticipated and folded into a greater design. Guilliman's eyes swept the hololithic map aboard the flagship. Light years of conflict unfolded before him, each engagement rippling into the next. He clenched his fists. "We cannot fight them all," he murmured, "not without unity." Yet even as he spoke, he understood the bitter truth. Unity was fragile, more so now with the divergent wills of 18 demigods converging upon a galaxy scarred by betrayal and time. The battle for the Imperium had begun, and it was not a war that could be contained, predicted, or restrained. Every strike, every command, every act of valor or fury was part of a cascading wave of violence that threatened to sweep the galaxy into either salvation or annihilation. And as the stars themselves shuddered beneath the psychic weight of the returning Primarchs, a single, resonant truth settled upon all who fought, lived, or commanded. The Imperium was reborn only through fire, and the fire had only just begun to consume. The golden light of the throne flared with a brilliance that rivaled the core of a sun. The Primarchs, standing within the chamber, felt it as a tide of psychic force, pressing upon their minds with the weight of 10,000 years. The custodians' halberds trembled, their disciplined forms unshakable, yet aware of a presence beyond comprehension. For a heartbeat, all movement ceased. Even the flickering of the lumen banners held still. The Emperor's will radiated outward, not in words, not in commands, but as a judgment that clawed through the warp and resonated in flesh and soul alike. Guilliman's fist clenched, his knuckles white beneath gauntlets forged for command and battle alike. He felt the weight of his brother's presence, the Lion, Russ, Vulcan, Dawn, Khan, and the spectres of the traitor Primarchs threading through the psychic tides. Each heartbeat in the galaxy mirrored the rhythm of the throne itself, a pulse of immense authority that demanded recognition. The loyalists understood the subtle threat. Their father's awareness did not merely observe, it judged, weighing their deeds, their choices, their purpose. One Primarch stepped forward, shoulders squared beneath ancient armor, and spoke quietly, almost to himself. "We have returned to this age, yet it is not as we left it. How much of it does he forgive?" Another's gaze swept over the cracked statues lining the chamber. Forgive or condemn? The throne flared again, and the floor beneath their boots thrummed with a power both alien and intimately known. Guilliman felt visions flash across his mind's eye. Hraxos burning beneath Lion and Russ, Varelion shattered under Angron's onslaught, Vulcan's fire leaping across the void, Dawn's hammer splitting the shadow cocoon. Every act, every strike, every consequence, recorded, weighed, distilled into the quiet, terrible calculus of the Emperor's judgment. A ripple of golden energy coursed across the chamber, and the Primarchs staggered under its intensity. It was a push, not violent, but inexorable, as though the Emperor's will sought to bend them to the inevitable truth of their existence. Even the loyal sons felt the burden. Their presence alone had shifted the balance of the galaxy, stirred war and chaos, and awakened forces that had long slumbered. Their triumphs were inseparable from the destruction their return had wrought. Guilliman's voice, steady yet strained, broke the silence. "Father, we act not for ourselves, but for humanity. Each choice we make, each action we take is in service of what you built." A tremor rippled through the throne in response, a wave that carried neither approval nor denial, only weight, the full presence of his awareness pressing down like a mountain across the galaxy. Vulcan stepped forward, hammer at his side, eyes glowing faintly with molten light. We do not seek glory. We seek balance. We seek the survival of what remains. He could feel the warp recoil from the throne's aura, twisting like a river confronted by stone, struggling yet compelled. The lion's gaze narrowed. And yet the shadow spreads, the traitors gather. What judgment can suffice for all that has been unleashed? Russ did not speak, only growled low in his throat, as if acknowledging the truth that each action carried both purpose and consequence beyond measure. The light of the throne intensified, washing the chamber in brilliance. Every Primarch felt their sins, their failures, and the weight of choice pressed upon them. The psychic resonance traced each thought, each hesitation, each plan to its origin. Even those who had returned in loyalty were not absolved. Their presence had reignited a galaxy at war, and the Emperor's awareness held them accountable for what was to come. A distant tremor reverberated through the warp, answering the Primarch's presence with the first pulse of the entity that had pursued them across the galaxy. It recognized the throne's light and recoiled, bending back, waiting. The Emperor's awareness reached outward, brushing against the dark currents, pushing, probing, establishing boundaries. Guilliman raised a gauntleted hand. "We will answer, Father. We will contain the chaos. We will strike the traitors and protect the Imperium." Yet, he glanced at his brothers, both loyal and those whose shadows lurked in memory. "We cannot do this alone. The galaxy trembles beneath what has been awakened." The throne flared brighter, sending a heatless, suffocating pressure into the chamber. The Primarchs bent instinctively, not in submission, but in recognition. Their father's judgment was not only of their deeds, but of their readiness for the trials yet to come. For a moment, silence returned. The golden radiance dimmed just slightly, enough to allow the Primarchs to meet each other's eyes. Their expressions mirrored the same understanding. They had been weighed, and the weight had been felt. Not a word had passed, yet the meaning was clear. Prepare. The galaxy would be remade. And the Force hunting, them, watching, waiting, adapting, would arrive in full knowledge that the Emperor himself now bore witness to all that was unfolding. The judgment had begun, and in that quiet, terrible pause, every Primarch understood that the next actions they took would determine not only their fates, but the fate of all humanity. The galaxy held its breath. Across worlds torn by fire and shadow, across fleets tearing through warp storms, across the scarred battlefields of Hraxos, Verelion, and countless other war-torn worlds, the Primarchs had gathered, their presence marking the culmination of an age-long absence. Every loyalist and traitor, every demon and mortal, felt the weight of their return pressing upon the cosmos like a tide drawn by a gravitational hand beyond reckoning. The tremor that had first heralded their arrival now resonated with the fullness of a force unstoppable, undeniable, and unbound. On Terra, the Emperor's radiance cast a brilliance that stripped the veils from the Chamber of Oaths. The Primarchs stood beneath the vast dome, armor scarred and bodies weary, yet eyes sharpened with clarity born of millennia of trials. The custodians' golden halberds gleamed in the light, unmoving yet alive with tension, while the warp itself quivered, aware of the enormity of the choice presented to these titans. Across the galaxy, each Primarch could feel the other's presences, a chorus of will and power that harmonized into an impossible symphony of purpose. Guilliman stepped forward, fingers resting against the railing, gaze fixed upon the throne. "We have returned," he murmured, voice steady yet weighted. "And we must decide, not for ourselves, nor for pride, nor for vengeance, but for the Imperium that remains. Vulcan's presence behind him radiated quiet power, molten heat coiling through the air as if the forge of his will might shape the very fabric of reality. The Lion and Russ exchanged a glance, silent acknowledgement that the battles of the galaxy would be fought not only with blades and bolters, but with the guidance of minds sharpened through aeons of absence. Beyond the confines of the throne, the traitor Primarchs observed. Their presence was a mirror to the loyalists, familiar, dreadful, their intentions unreadable, yet bound by the same gravity that drew all the sons of the Emperor toward this pivotal juncture. Angron's roar tore across the psychic currents, a declaration of unyielding war. Mortarion's malefic aura seeped into every weakened heart across the Imperium, chilling the blood of mortal and immortal alike. Magnus's eye glimmered with intelligence and caution, reading threads across the warp, anticipating strikes, weighing consequences, and foreseeing ramifications beyond the comprehension of even the most seasoned commanders. The entity that had hunted them since their return now revealed itself fully. Vast, unbound by mortal form, it pulsed through the warp like a living shadow, tasting the psychic signature of every Primarch, every loyalist marine, every demonic host. It recoiled at the Emperor's light, yet the hunger within it was relentless. This was no simple predator. It was a force of the cosmos itself, a mirror of the Imperium's potential for ruin and rebirth, and it moved with deliberate purpose toward the convergence at Terra. Guilliman raised his voice, carrying authority that resonated even through the psychic storm. Brothers, sons of the Emperor, the galaxy trembles beneath the weight of our choices. We have seen what remains of the Imperium, and we have seen what arises from shadow. Now we act. The others responded in unison, their assent unspoken but absolute, their will coalescing into a single point of resolve. Even the traitor Primarchs, sensing the inevitability of the confrontation, braced against forces they could not wholly anticipate. On Hraxos, the lion's blade carved a path through the demonic tide, Russ's fury driving enemies into retreat, Vulcan's hammer igniting void fire across a fleet of traitor warships, and Khan's speed ripped through warp-distorted corridors, dismantling threats before they could emerge. Dawn shattered the last of the Shadow's cocoon on the phalanx, while Angron's armies surged in counterpoint, feeding the fires of a galactic-scale conflict whose threads were visible only to those with the sight to comprehend. The throne flared again, radiance pouring into the chamber like a tide of golden judgment. Each Primarch felt the Emperor's awareness, the weight of millennia of expectation, and the burden of choice pressing down. Decisions must be made, unity or fragmentation, victory or ruin, salvation or extinction. Their acts would not merely shape battles, they would determine the very fate of humanity itself. Guilliman inhaled, feeling the presence of all his brothers and all their adversaries converge into a single psychic moment. "We will endure," he said, voice firm, "not for ourselves, but for what must live beyond us." The others echoed the sentiment in silence, their resolve forming an unbreakable lattice across space and time. The entity in the warp recoiled at the concentrated will of the Primarchs, sensing a force greater than any it had confronted. Yet its hunger remained. It pressed closer, folding the void, seeking an opening in the collective strength of 18 demigods. The galaxy quaked beneath the tension, stars flickering, worlds holding their breath, demonic hosts pausing mid-advance. And then, with the full force of their combined presence, the Primarchs moved. Not a single one faltered. Every action, every step, every strike of will radiated outward, countering the encroaching darkness, reinforcing the Imperium's fragile core and guiding humanity toward a path neither certain nor free of cost. The entity recoiled, its approach halted by the sheer immensity of their unity. Across the galaxy, loyalists rallied, traitors hesitated, demons screamed, and the warp itself bent around the psychic fulcrum that the Primarchs now embodied. The fate of the Imperium, of humanity, of the galaxy itself, had been forced to a single point of reckoning, and as the shadows writhed and the stars burned with the fury of battle, the Primarchs understood the truth of their return. They had come not to rebuild, not to reclaim, but to decide, to unify, or to witness the end. And in that instant, every living and immortal eye across the cosmos fixed upon them, waiting, knowing, and trembling.